Seren's a senior lecturer in public archaeology and archaeological science at Manchester Metropolitan University. She actually worked for many years at Oxford Archaeology. In 2020, she was the BBC AHRC New Generation Thinker. And she's got a particular specialism in scientific dating and ideas about time in archaeology. And one aspect of what she's doing at the minute is she's leading two major AHRC and IRC funded research projects about time, and that's what she'll be talking about today. First of these is Project Radiocarbon, in which she's hoping to assemble and validate radiocarbon data from across Britain Island within a sustainable, searchable archive. And the second is Project Time, which is a more sort of interpretive exploration of how we approach time in archaeology. So as you can see, Seren isn't able to be with us in person today, but her co-investigator on both projects, Neil Carlin, gladly is to join in with the discussion, answer all the questions wrong. And Neil himself specialises in interpreting human material landscape relationships in Britain and Ireland in the 4th to 2nd millennium BC. So one of several of us in the room who are not really specialists, but work on the fringes of environmental archaeology. So Seren, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Anwen. I'm just going to put my second slide on just to check that they move forward, or maybe I'm not. Hang on. There we go. And that I can see that that's changed in the room. So hopefully you can all hear me. Can somebody just acknowledge that you can hear my voice? Brilliant. Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you, Anwen and Tina, for the invite to speak. Sorry not to be there. I'm running around a bit at the moment. I want to also acknowledge, as Anwen mentioned, Neil and Tim, who is Neil's co-PI on this with me, and Tim, who's co-I on this project that I'm mainly going to be talking about. And the genesis of this project, I guess, comes from doing a lot of research in legacy data, both in developer-led professional archaeological practice and academic circles, and being frustrated with the lack of discoverability, accessibility, and reusability of a huge volume of legacy data that exists in the world. And I'll talk a little bit in more detail about that later on. I'd also like to acknowledge our colleagues on this project, which includes national heritage agencies in the island of Ireland and in Britain, and our funders, the Irish Research Council and the Arts and Humanities Research Council. Okay, so what I'm going to do is think a bit about the background to this project, the approaches we're going to take, some of the challenges that we've encountered along the way, and Tim will be very pleased to answer lots of questions on those challenges in more detail during the tea break. Thank you, Tim. And some of the outcomes that we hope to achieve during this project. What I want to start with is I want to draw right back from our data, and I want to think really holistically about the practice of archaeology, the context of archaeological interpretation. The fundamental thing that I think is really important here is that data are not atheoretical. They do not exist outside our interpretations. They are part of the central process, the process of doing archaeology, the verbiage, the how we practice. And in a slightly more specific point about chronometric data, they contribute both to our intellectual structures and our sequences of narrative, and that's really something. So what we are doing here now is not a bolt on. Tim referred to himself as simply a data nerd, or something I prefer, geek, but this is part of, this is ingrained into the practice of archaeology, and these things cannot be separated. We cannot think about our evidence strands as situated outside our knowledge structures. So I'll say more about that later on, maybe. So I want to start in 1929. I want to draw back from our data and think much more broadly. And specifically about this quote from Child. We find certain types of remains, pots, implements, ornaments, burial rites, etc. Such a complex of associated traits we should call a cultural group or a culture. We assume that such a complex is the material expression of what today we would call a people. I probably should have put a trigger warning up before putting this quote up, because it's hugely problematic for a whole range of different reasons. And one of the outcomes of the practice of this research project, Project Radiocarbon, I want is to challenge these kinds of ideas about what we might previously have called prehistory. I want to move forward into 1960 and think about something an indication of the revolutionary practice impacts that radiocarbon had. And this led to Libby being awarded the Nobel Prize, one of 2 Nobel Prizes for archaeological related research, with his development of radiocarbon. And this has been widely hailed as a revolution in archaeological understanding, and this was reflected in Libby's award of that prize. But I contend, along with colleagues, that actually we haven't had the full implications of any of the radiocarbon revolutions. And that's because we have failed as a discipline to understand the implications of time on our narratives, especially when we're writing about people without, or creating narratives for people without written records. And that takes me forward into 1981, where we encounter Glyn Daniel on BBC Radio 4's Desert Island Discs. Look it up, hear him speak. And what comes across when Daniel is being interviewed is the impact of the radiocarbon revolution on his research. And you can still hear that registered in his voice. The potential of independent chronology for archaeological narratives was huge. And, he's still shocked, decades later. And he says, what was revolutionary was that radiocarbon demonstrated fundamental flaws in the theory of archaeology as it had been practiced until the 1950s. And I contend that we actually haven't had that significant disjunction. There hasn't really been a revolution in how we write about cultures, as Child would put them. We're still essentially, this house contends that we are still practicing 1950s archaeology because we haven't integrated the structural changes that radiocarbon independent chronometric data sets could offer us. And this is one of the things that we're going to challenge with Project Radiocarbon. So chronometric data, chronology, temporal concepts provide us both sequence in terms of what happened when, or but it also provides us with a knowledge structure, a way of thinking about the past. When we talk about the Iron Age, we are using a particular way of engaging in the past that structures the kinds of narratives that we produce and the kinds of ways that we are capable of thinking about the past with. And this, in Clarke's terms, is a form of iconic analog. It's a metaphor. It's a way of talking about, thinking about the past that influences our discussion. And as Clarke wrote in 1976, these are structures, but they are representations of time and space. They're not in themselves inherently temporal or spatial. There is no such thing as an Iron Age radiocarbon date. There is a measurement that reflects an isotopic ratio related to the carbon cycle that was formed at a particular point in time and space. But it's not an Iron Age radiocarbon date in and of itself, by its nature. That is an interpretation that we bring to it. Okay, so slightly crunching gear change here from thinking about how we think about time into thinking about how these data exist in our contemporary practice. And one of the motivations for Project Radiocarbon was the huge value of chronometric data in our narratives. I've suggested that radiocarbon data are central to archaeological interpretation, and we've had this boom since the 1950s in the numbers of data that are being produced. And these allow us to do sort of large-scale analyses of activities in time and space, and they're really important. And this is a paper that I wrote with some colleagues about landscape division over the very long term, and so they can contribute to that. But we currently do not have any means of curating effectively these data. And this is what Penny Johnston, who is also in the room and will field questions on this, thank you, Penny, has termed the organics revolution and the curatorial crisis. And especially for radiocarbon data, because they are so commonly used, because there's been this boom in them, because they are relevant to about 60,000 years of human history and can be produced from sites across Ireland and the UK, we are losing millions of euros of data because they are being made rogue, being corrupted, being ineffectively curated. And this, in terms of the individual measurements, if you guesstimate a radiocarbon date as costing 300 quid to produce, is very expensive. But if you actually scale in the cost of fieldwork, the developer-led or academic cost of producing these data, millions and millions of euro are being wasted or being jettisoned because we are not effectively curating them. Now, intellectually, I find that quite objectionable. In a kind of public archaeological way, all of these data should be accessible and reusable. And while individual repositories exist for some of these data, based sometimes in national heritage agencies, based in individual labs, as the result of archaeological research organisations producing their own inventories, or from research projects, there is no long-term, or when we started this project, there was no long-term integrated curatorial system that allowed research across national boundaries in the islands of Ireland and Britain. And so interoperability is a key issue that we had to contend with. Okay, so what we're trying to do as part of this project funded by the IRC and AHRC is produce a new way of curating these data, and working with the universities of University College Dublin, Manchester Met, and our national heritage agency stakeholders across these national jurisdictions. We're trying to devise a means of curating these data and of validating these data, deroguing them, including all of the essential information that allows people to reuse radiocarbon data based on their specialist data attributes. So this is not simply a data mining exercise, this is a validating and cleaning exercise. And what we want to do is to make this scalable and live, so that it doesn't become a static resource, but it has legacy and longevity beyond our project timeline. And as part of this, we've had 2 postdoctoral researchers working on this project, Emma Hanna at UCD and Berserka Gadarska at Manchester Met. And we're going to produce a whole series of training resources alongside the database, which will be hosted by the ADS, with different national discovery routes, probably. So what we want to do is assemble and validate these data from across our study area, make this open, accessible, and interoperable, so connected research across our national jurisdictions, and enable a dynamic live resource. So I'm just going to look at some of the attributes that we've been curating and collecting, the radiocarbon specialist details themselves, archaeological information and site information. And what I want to emphasize as part of this is something Tim alluded to, which is the kind of specialist details and information that are required for highly scientific, highly technical resources like these. And we're trying to work across from the scientific data through to the archaeological context, which has been quite challenging in terms of the scale of the data that we're having to collect and curate. So this is an example of some of the specialist radiocarbon information that we've been collecting and the ways that we've been defining this. And what we're steering away from here, well, the thing that I'm really interested in this project is how we can use on-the-fly calibration for all of our radiocarbon data sets to work across those structural aspects of archaeological interpretation. So the idea here is that we are not using these kind of colonial terms like the Bronze Age or the Iron Age or whatever, these problematic laden value terms, but as the sole basis for interrogating the past. So if you want to find out what's happened in the 22nd century Cal BC across our different regions, you don't have to know those period specific, those cultural specific terms, and we can work across these. Anyway, sorry. These are some of the radiocarbon data, and here we have feature and sample information, so contextual information, so that if you want to know in that 23rd century material that comes from negative pit features, then you know, we can have some way into those different information sets. And further on, sort of even more archaeological information and contextual information, so that we're not just you know, we're adding value, resuscitating some of these archival information data sets. And then further spatial data, so that you know, if you're working in a particular townland or whatever, you can search by those spatial definitions as well. Sorry, I've just looked at the time, so I'm going to move on quite quickly. Some of the challenges in this, interoperability has been a real issue because of these kind of structural approaches in different regions. So working across the Chalcolithic, Bronze Age, however you want to call it, in different regions, and trying to get a data set that's interoperable in those terms. This meant that Neil and colleagues had to produce definitions, temporal definitions for different culture historic terms for the island of Ireland for the first time. So that was a challenge, but also an opportunity. Working across these different regions, nations, has been quite challenging because of different curatorial requirements by historic environment agencies and national heritage agencies. But that, I think, is an issue with any internationalized research. So, sort of parallel or developing from that, we've had challenges in terms of defining which exactly specialist data standards we're recording. So, for example, in terms of radiocarbon data sets, the level of geekery that we get into has been something that we've discussed quite a lot with our partners and collaborators, and that has been quite an interesting discussion. What I think this offers us is the opportunity for more sophisticated archaeological research to challenge those structural approaches that we have previously engaged with in the past. I think we can do some interesting big data research, not in terms of dates as data, as population data, but in terms of different curatorial approaches across the historic environment in these different nations. The real opportunity with this kind of research at this kind of scale, working across sector and internationally, is that we can have really creative and playful solutions to some of these challenges, and our differences in terms of organisations and sectors, our differences are our strengths, I would contend. Anyway, with a slightly rushed ending, and apologies for that, I'm not very good at online presentations, so I'd much rather have been there. But I'd like to thank you all for listening, and all of our project partners listed on the side there are some of our publications that give some of the sort of background and what we're hoping to achieve are listed there on the right. And thank you all very much for listening.